For Natasha and Boris, their dream outdoor ceremony took a wild turn as a massive brown bear decided to join the celebration, right at the buffet. Watch as one brave best man attempts to save the day, transforming their wedding into an unforgettable, chaotic adventure. This isn't your average wedding crash. It's a story that'll send shivers down their spines for years. On October 25th, 2024, a somewhat warm day in a small Russian village nestled near the Siberian wilderness, family and friends gathered to celebrate the wedding of Natasha and Boris. The bride and groom had always dreamed of an outdoor wedding, envisioning an open space surrounded by trees with sweeping views of the nearby forest. After years of saving and planning, and with the help of their closest friend, Lev, they had found the perfect place. Their dream had finally come true. Under a canopy of colored leaves and golden light, they toasted to their union, surrounded by loved ones who shared in their joy. As Natasha and Boris clinked glasses, laughter and warmth spread through the crowd, everyone blissfully unaware of what was coming their way. The rustic buffet had been set up under a cluster of trees, a long table laden with everything from smoked meats to elaborate desserts. The spread was impressive, a feast for the newlyweds and their guests. But the guests weren't the only ones who wanted a bite or two. Something else had caught wind of the feast. A massive brown bear sniffed the air as people basked in their joy. The animal stood watching at the edge of the forest. The scent of roasted meats, fresh pastries, and plump fruit wafted through the trees, drawing the bear closer to the clearing. The feeding season was at its height, and the bear, with its keen sense of smell, was on the hunt for an easy meal. Step by step, it moved with surprising silence, its massive frame concealed by the tree line. The first guest to spot the bear was a small child, wide-eyed and tugging at her mother's sleeve. She pointed toward the forest, where the creature had just lumbered into view. Her mother's eyes grew wide in horror, and soon whispers turned into gasps as more guests saw the approaching bear. A ripple of alarm surged through the crowd. Some guests stood frozen in shock, while others exchanged panicked glances, unsure if they were genuinely seeing a bear just meters away from the buffet. Suddenly, just as the first person started to scream, the bear made a decisive move. With one swipe of its massive paw, it knocked over the edge of the buffet table, sending plates and platters tumbling to the ground. Chaos erupted. Some guests dashed toward the safety of nearby cars, while others darted behind trees or crouched low in bushes, their wedding attire hardly suited for blending into the foliage. Tables were overturned, chairs were scattered, and in the midst of the chaos, Boris shielded Natasha, pulling her back, both watching in stunned silence as the bear helped itself to their expensive buffet. The bear pawed at the food, growling as it sampled the delicacies prepared for the guests. It tore into a dish of smoked fish, spilling food across the ground, then snatched a large chunk of meat, chewing noisily as if it were the honored guest of the day. The guests were a mix of horrified and awestruck, caught between fleeing and watching, mesmerized by the sheer power and size of the beast. The scene was both terrifying and, in an odd way, surreal. This creature was casually feasting on their wedding buffet like an uninvited guest from the wild. But amidst the chaos, one man didn't run. Lev, the best man and Boris's oldest friend, the very same Lev that had helped the couple find their perfect wedding spot, refused to leave the couple in the middle of this furry disaster. While everyone else fled or hid, Lev's mind raced for a solution. He scanned the ground, quickly picking up a fist-sized rock. He hurled it toward the bear with a deep breath, hitting it squarely on the shoulder. The bear paused, looking up from its feast, mildly annoyed but not deterred. Lev grabbed another rock and threw it again, harder this time. The guests, who had taken cover, peered from their hiding spots, astonished as Lev stood his ground. Another rock flew through the air, then another. Lev yelled and waved his arms, desperately trying to distract the bear from the leading group. The bear finally turned, annoyed by the disturbance, and focused on Lev. With a deep, resonant growl, it stepped away from the table, now focused on the strange man throwing rocks. Lev kept throwing, backing away slowly, each step bringing him closer to the edge of the clearing. The bear followed, lumbering toward him with steady intent, leaving a path of trampled food and broken dishes in its wake. Lev glanced around, plotting his escape route, knowing full well that if the bear decided to charge, there was no outrunning it. He just needed to keep it distracted long enough for everyone to escape. As he reached the tree line, Lev threw one last rock, then darted behind a thick tree. The bear, perhaps irritated by the hassle of chasing him, snorted loudly and stopped, sniffing the air again. Realizing its buffet had been left behind, it seemed to lose interest in Lev's chase and lumbered back toward the remains of the wedding feast. But by now, most of the food was scattered across the ground, and the bear's initial curiosity seemed to wane. After a few more sniffs and half-hearted attempts to salvage the meal, the bear turned back toward the forest, disappearing into the trees as swiftly as it had arrived. Guests slowly emerged from their hiding spots, exchanging nervous laughs and stunned expressions. A few brave souls tiptoed toward the now destroyed buffet, peering at the damage. The beautifully decorated table was overturned, and the food was reduced to a chaotic mess. Lev emerged from the trees, unscathed and grinning, brushing dirt off his clothes. He received a mix of cheers and laughter from the crowd, who now began to see the humor and the absurdity of it all. Natasha and Boris, though visibly shaken, managed to smile, grateful to have each other and their guests safe, even if their wedding feast had gone to a very different kind of guest. The celebration picked up again, albeit with a makeshift buffet. Guests recounted the event with a mixture of disbelief and amusement, some already embellishing their accounts of how close they'd been to the bear and how they'd narrowly escaped. Stories circulated about Lev's bravery, how he'd saved the day by staring down a bear. It was a tale that would follow him and the newlyweds for years to come. Jason had always been a city kid, born and raised in a bustling metropolis where the occasional city park was the closest he got to nature. Joining his university's hiking club in 2020 had seemed like the perfect escape, a chance to break free from the concrete sprawl and finally experience the wild Canadian landscapes he'd only ever seen on TV. So when he found himself in Banff National Park on a late autumn trip that year, he was thrilled, though painfully aware of his inexperience. The forest was breathtaking, a world away from anything he'd known. The towering trees were even more impressive than the skyscrapers he was used to. Jagged mountain peaks loomed in the distance, reminding him that life was something more than crowds, cars, and clubs. Jason's group hiked along the main trail, stopping occasionally to take pictures or admire the views, but Jason wanted more. His heart raced excitedly at the thought of seeing an untouched, hidden viewpoint. At some point, Jason broke away from the group. He promised himself he wouldn't go far. He reasoned that just a few meters into the trees, maybe to catch a better view of the valley below. The deeper he wandered, the thicker the trees became, and soon the cheerful sounds of his friends faded into silence. It was peaceful at first, just the gentle rustling of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Jason was sure he could easily find his way back, but after a while, as the shadows stretched and the light began to dim, a creeping unease settled over him, and he started feeling less sure. Being a veritable city kid, Jason pulled out his phone only to discover he had no signal. His stomach clenched and he turned around, trying to find his way back. But his surroundings felt strangely unfamiliar, as though the trees had shifted in his absence. He pressed forward, hoping the path would become clear, trying not to think about how much time had passed. And then he saw it. Not 20 feet ahead, partially hidden by a cluster of bushes, a massive brown bear rummaged through the undergrowth, its thick coat rippling as it moved. Jason froze, his heart pounding like a drum. He knew enough about the dangers of bear encounters to understand the importance of staying still, not making eye contact, and hoping against hope that the bear might pass him by. Jason tried to breathe quietly, his whole body locked in place as he watched the creature, every second feeling like an eternity. But luck wasn't on his side. The bear lifted its head, sniffing the air, catching the unmistakable scent of a human. It turned, and its dark eyes settled on him. Jason's stomach dropped. The bear huffed, taking a few slow, deliberate steps forward, sizing him up as though debating its next move. Jason could feel his legs trembling but stayed frozen, desperate not to provoke the animal's wrath. He tried to inch backwards slowly, 1 foot at a time, never breaking his gaze from the bear. But as he stepped, his foot caught on a hidden branch, sending him stumbling backward onto the ground. The snap of the branch echoed in the silence, and the bear let out a guttural sound, lowering its head, its gaze now sharp and intent. Jason's mind raced, struggling to remember every piece of advice he'd heard about surviving bear encounters. His hand instinctively went to his backpack, fumbling until he found the small whistle attached to his pack strap. Although the whistle was a lousy excuse for a weapon, it was all Jason had. With his heart pounding, he brought the whistle to his lips and blew as hard as he could. The sharp sound cut through the silence, loud and piercing. The bear flinched, pausing as if confused, and Jason seized the moment to scramble to his feet. He spotted a tree nearby, its branches low enough to grab. Adrenaline surging, he lunged forward and grabbed the lowest branch, hauling himself up just as the bear took another step toward him. Jason climbed, forcing himself higher and higher, his arms and legs aching with the effort. He reached a point where the branches were thinner but stable, and he clung to them, breathing hard and glancing down at the ground. The bear lingered below, prowling around the tree, sniffing and occasionally glancing up at him. Jason's heart raced as he watched, knowing that if the bear decided to climb, he would have nowhere else to go. Minutes passed, feeling like hours. The bear paced, occasionally rearing up on its hind legs, its massive claws scraping against the tree bark. Jason pressed himself against the trunk, his muscles cramping, every sense on high alert. He was too afraid to move, barely daring to breathe as he watched the bear circle, its attention fixed solely on him. He was keenly aware of the failing daylight, the cold seeping into his bones, and the growl of hunger beginning in his stomach. But nothing mattered except staying as still and as silent as possible. And then, the bear seemed to lose interest. It turned away, disappearing into the forest. Soon, its massive form was swallowed by the shadows. Jason held his breath, waiting, too shaken to climb down. He could still feel the terror, the memory of those eyes, and the sound of its breathing lingering in his mind. Night settled over the forest, and although there was no sign of the bear coming back, Jason remained perched in the tree, too fearful to climb down. He spent the night listening closely, cold and exhausted. Each time he tried to shift to a more comfortable position, images of the bear's jaws came to his mind. His muscles cramped, his hands and feet numb from gripping the tree so tightly. But he couldn't afford to relax. The bear might still be nearby, waiting, lurking just out of sight. The hours crawled by, each one colder and more uncomfortable than the last. Just as dawn's first light touched the sky, Jason heard voices calling in the distance. Relief flooded through him as he shouted back, his voice hoarse but urgent. A search team appeared below, their flashlights scanning the area until they spotted him clinging to the branches. Carefully, he made his way down, his legs wobbly, his body aching from the night spent in the tree. Once he reached the ground, Jason could barely stand, but he was safe, and that was all that mattered. As he was led back to camp, the terror of the night slowly gave way to the odd, surreal realization that he'd survived something he'd never forget. For a city kid like him, he'd done well. He couldn't wait to tell his story to everyone he knew. 44-year-old Hannah had spent most of her career in Alaska's rugged wilderness, tracking the behavior of the majestic brown bears that roamed its forests and mountains. She was a seasoned field biologist, accustomed to the dangers and unpredictability of the wild. Over the years, she'd gained respect for the animals she studied, learning to interpret their body language and understanding the boundaries she had to maintain for her own safety. Though fieldwork often required her to be near the bear's territory, she took every precaution. One evening in 2021, however, would test her instincts and training in ways she'd never imagined. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the forest, and a chilly breeze swept across the riverbank where Hannah worked. She was setting up a motion-activated research camera along a trail that bears frequented, hoping to capture footage of their natural behavior. She knelt down by the bank, focusing intently on the camera, adjusting its angle to frame the surrounding trees and rocky ground. The air was thick with the rich scents of the forest, mingling with the earthy smell of the river. A serene scene, just as she liked it. But then, just as Hannah finished setting up the camera, a low, rumbling growl interrupted the silence and filled her bones with dread. She recognized the sound immediately. It was too close and unmistakably from a bear. Hannah's heart pounded as she froze, her hands hovering over the camera equipment. She fought the instinct to turn and run, knowing that sudden movements could provoke an attack. She forced herself to breathe slowly, trying to quiet the panic rising within her. She'd encountered bears from a safe distance countless times, but this growl felt different, warning her that she had intruded into territory she was not welcome in. Steeling herself, Hannah slowly turned her head just enough to catch a glimpse of the bear. A small, hungry-looking brown bear stood only a few yards away, partially hidden by a thick brush. Hannah noticed a blood-stained patch of grass nearby, the remnants of a recent kill, likely the bear's meal. Her stomach churned as she realized she had unknowingly come too close to a bear's dinner. She was in its territory, and the bear's posture told her it wasn't pleased about the intrusion. Keeping her gaze down, she fought to control her breathing, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her bear spray. The canister was strapped to her belt, always within reach, but it felt miles away as she carefully moved her hand toward it, trying not to startle the bear with any sudden gestures. She felt the weight of the spray in her grip, its small size dwarfed by the enormous threat only a few yards from her. The bear took a step forward, its heavy paw crunching against the forest floor. Hannah's heart hammered in her chest. Her fingers trembled as she calculated her options. If the bear charged, her only chance was to aim directly at its face. But she knew that even with bear spray, there were no guarantees in a situation like this. The bear's intent was unclear, its dark eyes assessing her, its massive jaws slightly parted as it tasted her scent in the air. She held her ground, not daring to look directly into its eyes, but aware of every small movement it made. Hannah's muscles tensed and she braced herself for what felt inevitable. The bear shifted, inching closer, and every nerve in her body screamed for her to back away. But she remained still, knowing the risks of retreating too soon. The seconds dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity, her senses hyper-focused on every twitch and sound. Just as Hannah prepared to raise the bear spray, the bear halted. It lowered its head, sniffing the ground near its kill as though it had decided she posed no threat. Hannah held her breath, her heart still racing, and watched as the bear turned, giving one final glance in her direction before lumbering away, back toward the thick brush. Hannah didn't waste any time. He started running back to her vehicle, hardly able to believe what had just happened. Her body ached from the tension, her hands still gripping the canister of bear spray as if her life depended on it. She remained on high alert, listening to the fading rustle of the bear as it moved deeper into the forest, retreating to the safety of its hidden den. As she ran, she glanced around, half expecting the bear to reappear, but everything was silent again, as though the forest had returned to its usual calm. Once she reached her car, Hannah slumped in the driver's seat, the adrenaline draining from her, leaving her feeling both shaken and strangely humbled. She'd always believed that her training and preparation had given her an edge, a specific control over her environment. But in that brief encounter, she had faced the raw reality of the wild, a reminder that the unpredictability of nature limited her understanding of bear behavior. The wilderness was untamed, and it didn't care that she was a scientist or that she was well prepared. In the fading light of the Alaskan wilderness, she felt a shift within herself, a deepened respect for the creatures she studied. The bear had let her go that day, not out of understanding or mercy, but simply because it had chosen to. As she made her way back to camp, Hannah knew she would carry that encounter with her. She also realized she would have to go back and gather her scattered equipment, but this time, she wouldn't go alone. In June 2019, Jake and Will packed their gear and headed deep into the Appalachian Mountains for a long-awaited weekend fishing trip. It had been years since the two brothers had been able to take a break from their busy city lives, and the mountains felt like the perfect escape. Jake, the older of the two, had been fishing since he was a kid and saw himself as a bit of an expert, while Will, less experienced, was simply thrilled to be out in nature, learning from his brother. The brothers spent their days at the river's edge, casting lines and filling their cooler with fresh catches, savoring the crisp mountain air and the peaceful isolation of the forest. As the weekend went on, the brothers grew more comfortable in their surroundings. Even Will started to feel more confident in his skills. They laughed and shared stories as if they were kids again, playing in their parents' backyard. By late Saturday afternoon, they had gathered a decent haul and decided to set up camp not far from the riverbank. With the cooler full of fresh fish tucked between them, they relaxed around the campfire, roasting some of their catch over the flames. But unbeknownst to them, the smell of the fish had traveled through the woods, catching the attention of an unexpected visitor. A black bear, lean but massive, had picked up their scent from the dense trees nearby. Driven by hunger and curiosity, it crept through the forest, drawn to the rich aroma of the brothers' catch. The first hint of trouble came as Jake cast his line out once more, intent on pulling in one last fish before dusk. He spotted a dark shape between the trees, larger and more intimidating than anything he'd seen in the wild before. Squinting, he realized what it was. An adult black bear emerging from the forest, its eyes fixed on the cooler brimming with fresh fish. Heart pounding, Jake nudged Will, who quickly realized what was happening. The two brothers exchanged a silent look of alarm. They knew that black bears weren't generally aggressive, but the bear was too close for comfort, its focus entirely on the cooler filled with their hard-earned catch. Slowly, they began to back away, hoping their retreat would convince the bear to lose interest. But the bear had caught the irresistible scent of the fish, and the sight of the two tall human figures wasn't enough to deter it. The bear inched closer, eerily quiet. Its eyes were trained on the cooler. The brothers' movements grew quicker as they edged backward, stepping over fallen branches and brambles. But the bear kept closing the distance, its eyes wild with hunger. The realization struck them. This bear wasn't going to leave without a meal. The cooler wasn't worth it. Jake and Will abandoned everything, leaving their gear and the cooler behind, and turned to run. The forest floor was uneven, and they stumbled as they tried to keep their footing, but they didn't dare look back. The bear, seeing them running, shifted his attention from the cooler. It suddenly charged, its heavy footfalls pounding against the ground. Desperately searching for an escape, Jake spotted the river up ahead. Though the current was fast and churning with icy water, it was their best chance to put some distance between them and the bear. Without a second thought, the brothers sprinted toward the river, lungs burning and muscles straining, the sounds of the bear crashing through the underbrush behind them. As they reached the water's edge, Jake plunged in first, followed by Will. The cold hit them like a shock, nearly stealing the breath from their lungs, but they let the current pull them downstream, away from the bear and the campsite they'd so hastily left behind. The force of the water swept them downriver faster than they'd anticipated, carrying them away from the danger but into another battle of holding their footing against the swift current. They grabbed at branches and rocks along the shore, struggling to find stability in the rushing water. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the river's current slowed, and the brothers managed to drag themselves to a rocky bank further downstream. Drenched and exhausted, they clambered onto the shore, gulping in deep breaths, their hearts still pounding from the narrow escape. Glancing back upriver, they saw no sign of the bear, only the trees and the shadowy depths of the forest. Their supplies were gone, and they were left behind at the campsite along with their cooler and catch. Without food, a tent, or even a map, they were left with only the clothes on their backs and their wits. But the brothers felt a strange sense of relief, grateful to be alive and out of immediate danger. They looked at each other, sharing a silent understanding of how close they had come to disaster. The night was falling, and the forest around them began to darken, taking on a cold, unfamiliar edge. They knew they'd have to rely on their instincts to find their way back to the trailhead. Slowly, they began their trek through the woods, moving carefully in the fading light, each sound in the underbrush setting their nerves on edge. They were shaken, hungry, and uncertain, but alive. Hours later, just as exhaustion began to take its toll, they finally stumbled upon a well-worn trail, one that would lead them back to civilization. They walked the last stretch in silence, the reality of their encounter sinking in as they replayed each terrifying moment. They'd gone to the mountains seeking adventure, looking for peace in nature, but they'd found a stark reminder of the wilderness's untamed nature and the risks of underestimating it. When they finally reached the edge of the forest, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon, casting a pale light over the Appalachian landscape. They'd lost their gear and their catch, but their respect for the power of nature had deepened profoundly. They knew they'd be telling this story for years, not just as an adventure, but as a lesson in caution and the thin line between thrill and danger. Though they laughed about their clumsy escape in the weeks that followed, the memory of the bear's powerful presence stayed with them. It was October in a quiet town nestled at Yosemite's edge. Leaves rustled in the wind, swirling over the small streets as locals went about their day. Bear sightings were nothing new in the town. They were a part of life here, and residents were mainly accustomed to spotting a bear ambling around, sniffing for food in alleys or backyards. But in 2004, one particular bear, a massive, bold brown bear, had begun pushing boundaries. Mary, the town's beloved bakery owner, a no-nonsense woman, was finishing up for the afternoon, wiping down counters and organizing her shelves of freshly baked bread and pastries. Her bakery was a cozy spot, its warm lights a welcome sight in the heart of town, significantly as the days grew shorter. The townspeople loved the place, dropping by for warm loaves and sweets. Mary herself was as much a fixture of the town as the towering trees surrounding it. She'd been here for years, running her bakery and greeting every customer by name. She was as sweet as she was practical and bold. That afternoon, however, as she prepared to close, a loud clang from outside caught her attention. She stepped outside and saw a large brown bear rummaging through her trash cans, pushing them over as it searched for something to eat. But Mary wasn't going just to sit there and stare. When the bear began to nose closer to her shop's door, she knew she had to act. She clapped her hands and shouted, hoping to scare it away. But the bear ignored her, wholly absorbed in its search for food. It pawed through the scattered garbage, finding scraps of stale bread and paper bags, crunching and sniffing as though it had every intention of staying for a while. Mary's shouts grew louder as she tried to steer the animal back toward the edge of town. But calm, the bear took a few heavy steps forward, its eyes shifting toward the open door of her bakery, drawn by the scent of warm bread wafting from inside. Mary called out, hoping to attract someone's attention. But before she could retreat, the bear took a lumbering step past her and straight into the bakery. Inside, it sniffed the air, rumbling as it caught the scent of fresh pastries. With one mighty sweep of its massive paw, it knocked over a shelf, sending loaves and rolls scattering across the floor. Outside, a few townsfolk had gathered, drawn by the commotion. They watched in shock as the bear tore through the bakery, shelves clattering to the floor, flour bags bursting, and the ground covered in a white cloud. Mary managed to scramble outside, helplessly watching as her carefully arranged displays were turned upside down, pastries rolling and bouncing across the floor as the bear rummaged through its new treasure trove. Some of the onlookers tried clapping and yelling from the doorway, hoping to startle the bear, but it paid no attention. It sniffed its way around the shop, its nose twitching as it picked up the scent of sugary pastries. Wandering deeper into the aisles, it tore through anything edible in its path. It reached a tray of croissants and, with a chomp, sent crumbs flying. Mary stood outside with her hands clutched, eyes wide, feeling a pang of helplessness as this uninvited guest tore apart her bakery. She could hear the distant sirens of the park rangers approaching, but the bear showed no signs of leaving. It continued its rampage, knocking over a display case of scones and muffins, the delicate pastries tumbling like confetti. By now, nearly the entire town had gathered at a distance, watching the surreal scene unfold. Parents pulled their children back, some capturing the chaos on their phones. The bear paid no mind, utterly fixated on its haul. As it knocked over yet another shelf, a loud clang seemed to catch its attention. With a huff, it paused, glancing toward the open door where the townsfolk had gathered, their combined shouts and calls beginning to register. Slowly, as though deciding the treats had finally lost their appeal, the bear made its way to the door, casting one last look at the piles of pastries strewn across the floor. It huffed loudly, almost as if declaring its victory, and strode back outside, brushing past the crowd as it made its way toward the edge of town. The townspeople watched, relieved yet shaken, as the bear left, leaving behind a scene of destruction. Mary stepped inside, surveying the bakery that now looked like a war zone. Flour coated nearly every surface, and pastries lay crumbled and smashed across the floor. The once welcoming bakery was in shambles, a reminder of the risk they all faced living so close to the wilderness. Later that evening, the town council gathered for an emergency meeting. The bear's boldness had startled everyone, and they knew this wasn't something they could ignore. Conversations turned to the growing issue of waste management, with calls for stricter rules around securing trash and food scraps. Some suggested bear-proof containers for all businesses, while others proposed a town-wide effort to educate residents on safely handling food waste. The discussion grew heated as people argued for balance, protecting the town's safety without harming the bears that had been a part of their lives for so long. As the meeting went on, Mary sat unusually quietly, still shaken by the day's events but grateful that no one had been hurt. She thought of her bakery and felt a surge of resolve. This was a wake-up call, a reminder of the fragile line they walked every day, living in close proximity to the wild beauty and danger of Yosemite. The following day, as she opened her shop's doors once again, the smell of fresh bread wafted through the air, mingling with the crisp October breeze. This time, though, she'd taken extra precautions, double sealing the trash cans and making sure every crumb was safely stored away. The townsfolk stopped by, offering their support, some even laughing about the bear who came for dinner. By May 2024, Emily and Dave had spent months preparing for their Appalachian Trail adventure. Both city dwellers and thrill-seekers at heart, they'd often spoken of trading busy streets for towering trees and quiet streams, but nothing could have prepared them for this moment. It was early afternoon and the forest seemed alive with light. Every so often, the couple would catch glimpses of wildlife, a deer darting through trees, a squirrel scurrying up a trunk. The path was narrow, winding through dense woods, and they were several miles from the nearest campsite, relishing the peaceful solitude of the trail. As they rounded a bend, Emily suddenly stopped, a sharp intake of breath cutting the silence. About 20 yards ahead, partially obscured by shadows, stood a young black bear. It was small, likely an adolescent, its shiny coat almost blending with the surrounding foliage. It sniffed the air and for a brief moment seemed unaware of their presence. Heart-pounding, Emily gestured for Dave to stop. They'd both read about bear encounters and knew what to do: make themselves known, remain calm, and never run. Dave caught Emily's eye and nodded, his voice low but steady as he began to speak loudly, trying to alert the bear. They waved their arms, keeping their movements slow, hoping the bear would lose interest and wander back into the woods. But the bear didn't leave. Instead, it turned toward them, its small, dark eyes locking onto them with an unsettling curiosity. It took a few tentative steps in their direction, its nose twitching as it picked up their scent. The realization hit them both. This bear wasn't intimidated. If anything, it seemed intriguing. The couple inched backward, careful not to turn away, keeping their eyes on the bear. Every few steps, they paused, hoping the bear would take the hint and stop following. But in true adolescent fashion, the bear didn't want to give in to their expectations. Each time they stopped, so did the bear, and each time they moved, it followed, its steps slow but deliberate, as though studying them. Emily's pulse raced, her breaths shallow. She glanced at Dave, whose face was tense, eyes flicking between her and the bear. Trying to stay calm, they spoke in firm voices, hoping the noise would drive it off. But the bear only tilted its head, perhaps puzzled by their strange human sounds, and continued its slow, unnerving pursuit. When they stopped again, this time to gather their courage and assess their options, the bear froze, its posture shifting. It let out a low, rumbling growl that sent chills down their spines, a stark reminder of the raw power behind those curious eyes. Every nerve in Emily's body screamed for her to run, but she knew better. Turning their backs on the bear could provoke a chase, and in bear country, fleeing wasn't an option. Dave's hand went to his backpack, fumbling until he pulled out a can of bear spray. He raised it, his hand steady, eyes locked on the bear as he prepared for the worst. The bright orange canister would have to be their weapon and their shield. Slowly, Emily and Dave started to feel more confident. Indeed, they could take on a teenage bear. As if sensing the shift in their stance, the bear took another step closer but then hesitated, studying the can in Dave's hand. They held their ground, muscles tense, ready to spray if it lunged. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. The forest sounds faded, and all that remained was the silent standoff between human and bear. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bear's posture relaxed. It snorted as if bored or unimpressed, then slowly turned its head and left. Dave lowered the bear spray, his hand shaking slightly, and they both exhaled, releasing the breath they hadn't realized they'd been holding. Relief washed over them, mingling with a lingering fear that clung like a shadow. They'd just come face to face with the reality of the wild, a stark reminder of their vulnerability. Emily and Dave embraced and then, Gathering themselves, they continued down the trail. The trail remained clear, and the forest was peaceful once more, as if the encounter had never happened. They would later tell the story with hands still shaking, voices quivering as they recalled the bear's curious gaze, the sound of its low growl. But for now they moved forward in silence, grateful for their safety and mindful of the wilderness surrounding them.